Yes, I'm Belinda Hawkins, and this has been a 5-year journey for me, and it's been a very different exercise from being a producer, journalist on Australian Story, where I tend to spend a couple of months on a story, then I put the file back in a filing cabinet, kick the filing cabinet shut and say, next one, time to move on. This story got under my skin. It got under my skin pretty well from the day I got a phone call from a young woman. I was in an edit suite. I was working on a story about a little girl who was dying of leukemia, and her parents were desperate to find a cure for her. They were looking at having another child in the hope that the stem cells from that child might help the one who had this terrible disease. I was looking at the pictures in front of me. We were trying to get music to fit, and I got this call. A young woman said, "Hi, I'm Ash. I got your number from a former intelligence officer in the army who I'd used on a story once. He said to call you. He said you might be able to help investigate this terrible thing that's happened to my friend. My friend's name is Jock Palfreeman, and he's been charged with murder in Bulgaria." And I thought, whoa, I'm busy with something else, but 21-year-old. I had a son at that point who was about 17, a daughter who was 15. That could have been my child. I always travelled around the world. I knew what it was to be a backpacker. I felt immediately for the young man who'd been charged with murder, and I felt for his parents. I also knew very quickly that a young man had died. Didn't know anything else, but a young man had died. I completely felt for whoever his parents were. That young man was Bulgarian, and of course Jock was a 19-year-old who'd left Australia, gone off on the trip of the lifetime, fallen in love with Bulgaria, had a Bulgarian girlfriend, motorbike, a dog called Walkabout, lived in the mountains outside the capital city, and had gone away for some time and then come back to Bulgaria when he was 21 and was on a Christmas holiday. This young woman, though, Ash, couldn't tell me much more. She said the only man who's going to be able to fill in the pieces is Jock's father, and he's called Dr. Simon Palfreeman. He's a pathologist and he lives in New South Wales. I go, great. What's his number? Oh, she didn't know his number. And then she added, and he won't talk to a journalist. Immediately, I knew this was a story I was going to get to the bottom of. Anyone who won't speak to you is irresistibly fascinating, however insane and macabre that might seem. I had to go on with the edit in front of me. That night I went and I Googled Jock Palfreeman. I couldn't remember anything about a Jock Palfreeman. This was in June 2008. Googling, I found that he'd been arrested on December 28th, 2007. So I was about he'd been incarcerated for 6 months by the time I came on the scene. And I found that he'd been charged with the worst count of murder in Bulgaria pretty well, something that's called murder with hooliganism, and it's a charge that comes from the 45-odd years of communism that Bulgaria, which is up by Turkey and Greece, in that part of the world, Romania, across the sea from Russia. Murder with hooliganism means that there's no real motive the prosecution can find, and so hooliganism means you simply went out with unprovoked to take out as many people as you can. So Jock was charged with murdering someone and having his only intent was to really take out as many young Bulgarians as possible. He was also charged with attempted murder because there was a young man who sustained a single knife nick. I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I tried finding Simon Palfreeman for days and days and days, through all the traditional means, going through the white pages. Finally, someone got hold of him and he finally rang me very nervously, didn't want to speak to a journalist, and then did. And he unfolded all his fears. He's a middle-class well-educated father who's very, very conservative, always plays by the rules. He had no idea, really, what had happened to his son. He went through all the confusion of, did my son lose the plot? Did he just suddenly go out and stab someone in the middle of the night? At the same time, he knew that his son was, from his school days, an impulsive boy, yes, but a young man who was driven by this desire for social justice. He was the boy who would go and help a young kid in the playground if he was being picked on. He was a teenager who, even though he was at some of the elite private schools in Sydney, would get out of his school uniform, or even in his school uniform, go down to Green Left Weekly and volunteer to hand out newspapers. So he was a social activist, went on anti-Iraq war demonstrations, went on anti-Howard's detention centre demonstrations. Right from when he was a little boy, he was, if you like, socially conscious. I got to Bulgaria at the start of 2009. By that stage, it was very apparent to me from what I read and from the bits that I was able to glean from Simon Palfreeman that the trial was seriously going off the rails as far as the defence was concerned. I'll just give you a snapshot of what happened the night all this began, and then I'll help you understand a little bit of what happened to the trial. On the night, in the early hours of December 28th, 2007, Jock was with a young Bulgarian he'd just met and an English friend. They were in a downtown city square. They'd been drinking in a bar. Jock had a blood alcohol level of 0.1. They were trying to buy something from a kiosk. On the other side of the city square, they were in the city square. On the other side of the city square, coming out of a metro station, was a large group of some 15 to 20, mostly young men, but a couple of women, shouting, singing football songs. According to independent witnesses, they were football fans. They hadn't been to a football match, but they were football fans. It was later found that the one who died had a blood alcohol reading of 0.29. The one who was injured had a blood alcohol reading of 0.18. So we can assume there was a lot of alcohol among the group in some form or other, I think. They were coming out, they were noisy. Jock and his mates ran away from the square, fearful they could be football hooligans. His two mates sort of ducked down and didn't watch, but Jock kept an eye on what was going on, and he always alleged that at some point he saw some of the group lunge at a stranger, and then all the group chase after two men he thought were gypsies. Now, in Bulgaria, like in much of Europe, gypsies or Roma are a reviled minority group. And this is a massive problem for human rights groups in Europe, indeed in many parts of the world. They're very definitely a minority group, and they're seen as pickpockets and outsiders and ne'er-do-wells. So Jock thought he saw them chasing a gypsy, and then he saw them push one of the gypsies to the ground and start attacking them. At that point, he always said, he ran across the square, to the assistance of the gypsy on the ground. When the attack turned on him, he pulled out, fatal mistake in some respects probably, pulled out a pocket knife. He had that night scooped up from a kitchen table, it wasn't his knife, and put in his pocket. He pulled out this pocket knife and started waving it around. The group kept coming at him, and so he tried to move them away from the gypsy and himself. In the ensuing melee, he was hit to the ground, he tried to escape, and the young man, Andrei Monov, was fatally stabbed, a single stab wound, and another one was injured. Jock was injured in the head, and he was then arrested. And the rest, in a sense, has been history. During the court case, it became apparent that CCTV footage, which might have shown that moment in this swirl of events when Jock had a knife and was waving it around, might have shown the moment when the young man was stabbed. It might also have shown the beating of the gypsy that Jock alleged was what prompted him to run into this event. That CCTV footage mysteriously disappeared. That was always a problem with the investigation. During the trial, the friends of the dead young man, who was a 20-year-old law student, started changing their statements, changing what they'd told police. So they now said, gypsy? There was never a gypsy. An attack on a gypsy? There was never any problem with anybody. This stranger just suddenly came at us for no reason. That's not what they'd told police. So the defence was finding it harder and harder, I could see, to get a grip on how to fight this. And a central problem, and one of the things that so fascinated me from the beginning, was that in the Bulgarian system, a form of the continental inquisitorial system, it's a different legal system from what we have, the civil claimants, the people seeking compensation, the victims, were able to play a key role in the case. At that stage, they were able to block evidence from being heard, and they did. Every time it would support the defence case, they blocked it. So the defence was never able to say, excuse me, but you told police in this signed witness statement that you were attacking a gypsy, or that there was an altercation of some sort, and that the foreigner had intervened to help the one being attacked. They could never do that. They were like slipping around, unable to get traction. When I arrived in Bulgaria, I was nervous. I had no idea what to expect in this fascinating, ancient country. And as I went into court, I saw Jock coming into court, handcuffed, young man, could have been anyone's son. I saw the grieving parents, who you can only empathise with, and I saw Simon, who I by that stage had come to know. What was astonishing was that the parents of the dead young man stood at the front of the court, along with Simon, who, because of a peculiarity in the Bulgarian system, was able to be part of the defence team, and so effectively was behaving as one of the lawyers for his son. There was a Bulgarian lawyer and Simon. The father of the dead young man, Andrei Monov, stood there a metre, if you like, away from Simon Palfreeman, with Jock standing next to them as well. The two fathers were there fighting for their sons. So close were they standing, they could hear each other's heartbeat, they could hear each other breathe. And I wanted to know then how this would end up. How would the father of the dead boy deal with the court case, with the whole desire so many people who are grieving have for revenge? How would Simon's relationship with his son, given they were such different people, how would that unfold? I saw Jock and Simon in prison argue terribly with each other. Jock wanted his father to go to the media, to be far more aggressive. Simon didn't want to upset the Bulgarian authorities. He didn't want to put a foot out of place. He was nervous. He's not naturally someone who would ever be a lawyer. He's used to looking down microscopes. Father and son argued terribly, as you can well imagine, and as the pressure increased, so too did the intensity of their relationship. And having children of my own, I wondered, how are they going to survive this? And at the same time, it was very clear to me that what was coming out in court was not the full story. And so a year went by. The trial took about 18 months to unfold. Simon went back and forwards to Bulgaria some 30 times at that point. Ultimately, he would have gone backwards and forwards some 40 times. At the last hearing day, he leant across to his son. He tried to do up his tie. You could feel all that what a parent would be going through in that situation. The stakes were inordinately high. The parents of the dead young man and the prosecution wanted life. The parents wanted life without parole. Jock was facing dying in prison, being buried in prison, effectively. Of course, the defence was arguing that Jock, if indeed it had been his knife that had that had caused the fatal blow, that he had wielded his knife in self-defence. There was doubt about the pathology reports. There was doubt about whether it was even Jock's knife, the knife Jock carried, that had dealt that fatal blow. Simon thought, now the evidence that has been able to come out seems to show it certainly showed to him, and it seemed that any lawyer would see it, any judge would see it, that there was reasonable doubt that Jock was the guilty party, and there was every reason, there was a lot stacking up in Jock's favour. Eyewitnesses said they saw exactly what Jock described had happened. But the judge came back with a guilty verdict. The sentence was 20 years, so nobody won out of that. Not truth, not justice, not a desire for revenge, not the possibility that it was self-defence. Nobody was a winner. I followed the case further, and it went into an appeal and then into the final appeal, and Jock lost on, the defence lost on all fronts, and he's still now in prison with this 20-year sentence. Meanwhile, Andrei Monov, the father of the dead young man, wasn't just any old father. The child who died, tragic and horrific as that was not the child of just any old parents. This is a well-connected family. That doesn't mean anything necessarily, but in a small community, a community known for contacts and connections being everything, a country with a population of just over 7 million, a well-connected family is going to have some clout. And this is an ongoing problem in the Bulgarian justice system and in all its civil institutions. And it's something the European Union is grappling with and has been grappling with since it made Bulgaria a member of the European Union the year that Andrei Monov died and that Jock Palfreeman was arrested. So Andrei Monov and his wife are well connected. I couldn't really work out how well connected they were at that stage. That's, in the last few months, become very clear. Andrei Monov was a psychologist. He was always in the media. He joined the media kind of whole shouting match that Jock was a butcher, a sociopath before he was found guilty, that he was a trained killer. And the father of the dead young man would say, and that he had the professional expertise to tell that. At the funeral was the head of the highest court in Bulgaria, the man who was soon to be interior minister, and so on. So there was a lot at stake and a lot stacked up against Jock, and a lot of unanswered questions as far as I was concerned. I then hired a young Bulgarian journalist, got hold of the court file, tracked down all the witnesses I could find, and many of the friends of the young man, the mother of the dead young man, the police investigator, the prosecutor, even some of the judges, particularly the trial judge, talked to me about their impressions of what had happened during the trial and, of course, that night. Finally, I got access to some traffic recordings that filmed most of what happened that night, other than about 2 minutes or a minute and a half. But all this sort of 5-minute scenario, most of it was on that footage. And I watched it over and over again. And at that point, all of the police witness statements and where I was positioning people and how I thought they saw things, it all became very clear. And all I could think was that none of the judges in that case or the prosecutor, in all reasonable doubt, could have watched that footage carefully, could have watched it indeed at all. The footage was dismissed by one court after another. And yet, however hazy it is, however indistinct the figures are, however poor quality it is, it shows a sequence of events. And I have to say, the sequence of events was the sequence of events that Jock described from day one. Was it a travesty of justice? In this book, I leave it to you, the reader, to figure out and to just make your own decisions. There will always be questions about why Jock carried a knife, about the need or not lack of need to run into an affray. All those questions are moral questions that only you, the reader, can answer. At the end of this, in the last few weeks, I've found Bulgaria in the state of yet another political run of confusion and uproar. Christo Monov ran for power in a recent election, a May 12 election. He ran for power with the Socialist Party that was in power when Jock was arrested. He got in. When he was running for power, he said his first thing would be, if he got elected, was to make sure that Jock would never get out of prison, that he would never be transferred to an Australian prison, which is what the Palfreemans now want to see happen. Not that he's freed, but that according to a treaty that both countries have signed, he's brought to an Australian prison. Christo Monov said over his dead body would that ever happen. He was elected. The Socialists didn't win all the votes. They've got into power with a kind of unholy coalition of unlikely partners. They then put a most unfortunate person into the position of head of like the effective ASIO, and the public rose up in objection, saying the last government we protested against because it was corrupt, and this government is no better. And that now Bulgarians are protesting for the 13th day in a row, asking for a change of government, a change to the whole system, an end to the corruption that has plagued this fantastic country for so many years. Christo Monov came out in the middle of this and described the protesters as internet lumpen or internet idiots, that they were blindly led along, that they had no cause to be doing what they were doing. And an uproar went out on social media about him. So this is a fascinating time to see how Bulgarians are going to, or not going to, change their views on the kind of unholy alliance between government, institutions, the justice system, and a mafia that has free licence in many ways in that country. How they're going to change or not change their views on this case that I've been studying now for 5 years. So I'll be watching with interest, and I think certainly the Palfreemans will, and I think all those Bulgarians genuinely concerned with their institutions and with the way justice is carried out in that country. I think they'll all be watching very closely. At the end, I go back to what I started with the story of a love story. At the end, Simon and Jock, for all their differences, have come together and have come to understand each other, even though they still have terrible arguments about different things. They've come to see each other not just as father and son, the son in this situation, terribly dependent on his father and resentful often because of that. They've come to see each other as two adults. And I've found it to be something of a beautiful love story, very different from the revenge that Christo Monov really unquenchably seeks or thirsts after. So this is a love story, and it's a love story in which Jock is now fighting for the rights of other prisoners. He's constantly in trouble, much to his father's chagrin. He's now won one court battle. He's won actually two in the Bulgarian legal system. The big one was to set up the first ever Bulgarian convicted prisoners union or association. So he's working with this major human rights group that has taken on his case as an exemplar of what goes wrong in a system the European Commission has criticised as being corrupt and as having serious problems. He's taking cases of other prisoners with the human rights group to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, if this was my son, I would be utterly beside myself. Keep your head down, boy. And that he won't. It's made one thing very clear to me. I've spent hours and hours and hours with Jock. I've asked the same questions, but why a knife? I've probed inside out, trying to see if maybe he was, as the prosecution said, a ruthless killer. I've tried to see if he was, as the prosecution-appointed psychiatrist said, not aggressive by nature. I've come to realise that if there's one thing Jock is, he's someone who walks the talk. And we can be fairly, absolutely sure that when he says he ran to the assistance of someone, that's what he did, because that's what he's done ever since, for all the consequences it's brought to him. And I think that's another matter that we need to concentrate on as a community. Do we want people to go to the assistance of someone in need? I think we absolutely do. I think how it's done is something we can all argue about. But to say we don't want someone doing that is probably a tragedy. Thank you very much.